No one knew the new kid was the principal's son until a teacher poured glue in his hair and the truth turned a whole school upside down. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of room 203 at Springfield Middle School, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The desks were arranged in neat rows, waiting to be filled with voices, scribbles, and the nervous energy that came with the first day of school. In the second row, near the window, a quiet boy sat alone, fingers brushing the edge of a new textbook. His name was Elijah Carter, and today was his first day, not just at a new school, but in a new beginning. He glanced around the room, eyes lingering on the bright motivational posters hanging a little too straight, the blue lockers just outside the doorway, and the faint scent of fresh paint mixed with lemon-scented cleaner. Everything looked polished, but unfamiliar. He reached up and adjusted the edge of his hairline, his locks neatly twisted and carefully styled by his grandmother the night before. "You look handsome," she had said, gently patting his shoulder. "Be proud of who you are." Elijah wasn't just any new student. What none of the other kids knew, what even the teachers hadn't been told, was that Elijah's father, Henry Callahan, was the new principal of Springfield Middle School. It was a quiet agreement between father and son. "Let's keep it to ourselves for a little while," his dad had said at breakfast that morning, tightening his tie in the hallway mirror. "Make friends for who you are, not who I am." They'd left the house separately. Different cars, different entrances. Elijah liked it that way. It gave him a chance to be just a boy in a school full of new faces. As the classroom slowly filled, Elijah watched how the other kids moved with casual confidence. Some hugged, some fist-bumped. Others were already trading stories about summer trips, soccer wins, and camp adventures. He kept to himself, pulled out his notebook, and placed it neatly on his desk. Just then, the classroom door opened, and in walked Mrs. Margaret Tate. She was older, with grey hair pulled tightly into a bun that didn't dare move. Her mouth pressed into a line so thin it looked like it had forgotten how to smile. She walked to the front of the room, set down a stack of papers, and without preamble began taking attendance. One by one, she called out names. Each time a student answered, she checked the list and moved on. When she got to Elijah's name, she paused, just for a breath. It was quick, so small that most wouldn't notice, but Elijah did. He was watching closely. Her eyes lingered a half-second too long. Then she continued. That morning, Elijah did everything right. He raised his hand when he knew the answer. He stayed quiet when he didn't. He followed instructions, sat up straight, and kept his desk spotless. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was just trying to belong. When the writing assignment came, Elijah smiled a little. Writing was his thing. He took out his pencil and began carefully crafting a short essay about the trip he took with his family to the Science Museum last summer. He described the hands-on experiments, the robotics exhibit, and how his dream was to become a scientist one day. It was honest, thoughtful, real. When he handed the paper in, Ms. Tate didn't say a word. She took it, gave it a single glance, and set it at the very bottom of the pile. At lunch, a boy named Logan Bennett invited Elijah to sit with him. Logan had kind eyes and a loud laugh that made people feel at ease. They talked about video games, favorite snacks, and the school's upcoming science fair. For a little while, Elijah forgot he was new, forgot he was hiding anything. For a moment, he felt like maybe this place wouldn't be so bad. But when they returned to class, something shifted. Ms. Tate handed back their essays, red ink bleeding across the pages. Elijah's heart sank. A minus, the lowest grade he'd seen in over a year. He opened the paper slowly. Words were crossed out. Comments in the margins critiqued his sentence structure and called a heartfelt paragraph too dramatic. He looked to his right. Logan had written about soccer camp and earned a solid A. Elijah tucked the paper away, swallowing the knot forming in his stomach. Maybe she's just a tough grader, he thought, but as the day continued, the pattern began to unfold. Ms. Tate interrupted him twice while he was answering a question. She made him wait to sharpen his pencil after 3 others had already gone. During art period, she skipped over his desk entirely, even as she stopped to help every other kid in his row. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious. But it was steady, and it was enough to make the classroom feel colder. When the final bell rang, Elijah packed his things quietly. He passed his father's office on the way out. Through the glass panel, he could see Principal Callahan deep in conversation with another teacher. Their eyes met briefly. His father gave him an encouraging nod. Elijah managed a small smile and kept walking. That night, when his mother asked about his first day, he shrugged. It was okay. But later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, he couldn't shake the feeling in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something heavier. Something he didn't have the words for yet. He closed his eyes and heard his grandmother's voice again. Stand tall. Be proud of who you are. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance, and Elijah Carter was ready to try again. By the end of his first week at Springfield Middle School, Elijah Carter had memorized the classroom routines, learned which hallway lockers stuck, and figured out which cafeteria line moved fastest. He found small comfort in routine, in knowing where to sit, in greeting Logan Bennett at lunch, in the warm nods from a few teachers who already remembered his name. But inside room 203, something still didn't feel right. Every morning Elijah arrived early. His desk was always neat, his supplies organized. He answered questions clearly when called upon and never once acted out. Yet the looks from Ms. Margaret Tate remained cool. Her voice, when speaking to him, carried a tone that hovered between forced politeness and something less kind. At first, he thought he was imagining it. He gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just a strict teacher. Maybe she had high standards for everyone. But little by little, it became harder to ignore. It was in the way she called on him less often, the way she corrected him more sharply than other students for minor things, the way she smiled at other children when they walked through the door, but merely nodded when he entered. The following Monday, Ms. Tate assigned a vocabulary quiz. Elijah had studied carefully, flipping flashcards at the kitchen table while his grandmother cooked dinner. When the papers came back, his grade was a C-. He blinked at the page. 2 of the answers marked wrong were correct. He checked twice, then a third time. He glanced at Logan's paper. Logan had received an A. Their answers were identical for half the questions. Elijah considered raising his hand to ask, but something inside told him not to. The week continued. During a math lesson, Elijah was solving a problem at the board. Miss Tate stood behind him, tapping her foot. "We don't have all day," she said flatly. Elijah's hand trembled slightly. He finished the problem, and it was right. But Ms. Tate offered no praise, no comment at all. Later, when another student, Lisa, solved a nearly identical problem, making 2 mistakes along the way. Ms. Tate's tone was gentler. "Take your time, dear. Math can be tricky." Elijah didn't say anything. But Logan caught his eye from across the room. It was the kind of look that asked, "Did you see that too?" At lunch, Logan brought it up. "My mum's a teacher at another school," he said, picking at his apple. "She says teachers aren't supposed to treat kids differently like that." Elijah shrugged, trying to seem unbothered. "Maybe she's just tough." But in truth, his stomach was knotted. The unease was no longer just a feeling. It was a pattern. Then came the history project. Each student had to give a short presentation on their family heritage. When it was Elijah's turn, he stood proudly and shared stories about his grandmother marching during the civil rights movement, about his family's deep roots in the community, about his dream of using science one day to help others the way his family had inspired him. Midway through his speech, Ms. Tate cut in. "That's enough," she said briskly. "Let's give others a chance now." He still had 2 minutes left. The timer was right there on the wall. The next student talked about summer vacation and ran over time. Ms. Tate smiled and clapped softly at the end. "Wonderfully detailed," she said. Elijah sat down quietly, but Logan leaned over. "That wasn't fair," he whispered. Elijah nodded once, but said nothing. Word started to spread. Students began noticing the pattern. The way Ms. Tate walked past Elijah's desk without acknowledgement, how she wrinkled her nose when passing behind him, how she dismissed his questions, how his hand would stay raised, unseen, while others were called on again and again. Mr. Gregory Hale, the science teacher, seemed to notice too. He started pausing more often near room 203. Once, after hearing Ms. Tate's raised voice through the door, he stepped in to borrow a piece of chalk. He stayed longer than necessary, asking casual questions. Things always seemed to quiet down when he was there. Still, Elijah never said a word. Each night, his mother asked how school was going. "It's okay," he would reply. He didn't want to worry her. Didn't want to burden his father either, who was often in meetings late into the evening, trying to improve the school's equity programs. Elijah knew his father was working hard. The irony wasn't lost on him. But every night, Elijah stayed up a little later, rechecking homework he knew he'd already finished correctly. Every morning, he woke up a little more tired. Some of his teachers praised his work. His science projects were displayed in the hallway. His art teacher said he had a gift for detail. In PE, he was the first pick for team relays. But in room 203, his grades dipped lower with each assignment. His voice grew quieter, his shoulders just slightly more slouched. Yet through it all, Elijah remembered his grandmother's voice. "Stand tall, baby. You know who you are. Don't ever let them tell you different." So he did. Every morning, he walked through the school doors with his head held high. But even the strongest spirit can only bend so far before something has to break. And break it would, sooner than anyone expected. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon. The art room buzzed with the usual chatter of students cutting paper, squeezing glue, and comparing how crooked their pumpkins looked. Orange and yellow construction paper littered the floor in cheerful piles. Outside the tall windows, the sun poured in warm and golden, casting patterns on the linoleum tiles. Elijah Carter sat at his table near the back of the room, carefully shaping the curves of a paper pumpkin. His desk was neatly arranged, glue, scissors, colored pencils, all lined up in quiet order. Next to him, Logan Bennett was wrestling with a jagged shape that looked more like a crushed leaf than a pumpkin. "I call this modern autumn," Logan joked, lifting the mess like it belonged in a gallery. Elijah smiled, grateful for the moment of lightness. It had been a better day so far. Ms. Tate had kept mostly to herself, handing out materials without comment, lips pressed into that familiar tight line. Elijah had begun to think maybe, just maybe, today would pass without incident. Then she reached their table. She paused in front of Elijah's desk, staring down at his clean workspace with a strange look, one that sent a prickle across the back of his neck. "I see you're actually following instructions for once," she said, her voice sharp and loud enough for nearby students to hear. Elijah didn't respond. He kept his eyes on his work, adjusting the green stem he was cutting. A few kids looked up, then looked quickly away. They'd grown used to moments like this. That didn't make them easier to witness. A voice from the other side of the room called out, "We need more glue over here." "Ms." Tate turned to respond. Elijah exhaled slowly. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. The room settled back into its usual hum. Elijah focused on outlining a border of leaves for his project, letting the sounds of paper tearing and scissors clicking fill the space around him. Then he felt it. Something cold, wet, heavy. At first, he thought someone had spilled water, but the sensation was wrong. Sticky, thick, unnatural. His heart jumped in his chest as his hand instinctively reached for his head. And then he smelled it, a harsh, chemical odor, not the washable craft glue from the tables. This was something else. Elijah's fingers froze. Behind him, standing stiff and still, was Ms. Tate. In her hand, still open, was a small silver bottle. It was unmistakable. Super glue, the industrial kind, the kind locked away in the supply cabinet. The kind that didn't wash out with water or come off with a tissue. The room went silent, a pencil dropped somewhere in the corner. Someone gasped. "Oh my!" Ms. Tate said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." Elijah sat frozen, his hands still lightly touching the sticky mess, now coating the roots of his carefully styled locks. The same locks his grandmother had retwisted with such care just 2 nights ago. The same locks that reminded him of where he came from. From behind him, a camera phone clicked. Then another, Ms. Tate's face changed, just for a moment. A flicker of panic crossed her eyes. "I'll get some paper towels," she muttered, already turning. But everyone in the room knew. Paper towels wouldn't fix this. Elijah didn't move. His chest tightened. His scalp began to itch. He knew what superglue did, knew how it hardened fast, how it pulled at skin, how it clung like cement. David stood up first. "I'm getting the nurse," he said, his voice shaking. Before Miss Tate could stop him, he was gone. Other students started to move. One by one, they pushed back their chairs, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Then Emmy, who sat 2 tables ahead, turned around. "That wasn't an accident," she said clearly. "The craft glue is in plastic bottles with orange caps. That one's metal." "That's from the locked cabinet." More voices joined in. "I saw her take it out earlier. She didn't help anyone else with glue. You need a key to even get that bottle." Ms. Tate had gone pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She looked around the room, now full of eyes that had finally stopped looking away. Students were recording. Taking photos, whispering in anger. Elijah still hadn't moved. The glue was drying now, tight against his scalp, but he wasn't crying. He wasn't trembling. Something inside him had shifted. The fear, the doubt, the quiet endurance he had carried every day into room 203 had cracked wide open. In its place stood something new. Not anger, not shame, but certainty. This time, the truth would not be buried. This time, people had seen. This time, they were speaking. And there was no going back. The hallway outside the art room had never felt so loud. Even though no one was yelling, the whispers carried like thunder. Students who passed the open doorway slowed their steps, glancing in with wide eyes. Everyone had heard the gasp. Everyone had seen the stillness. And some had already seen the photos. Inside the school nurse's office, the atmosphere was very different. Nurse Lena Ruiz moved carefully, her gloved hands soaked with warm water and cotton pads. Elijah sat in the exam chair, perfectly still, his eyes focused on the ceiling. His hair was sticky and matted, the sharp chemical scent of superglue mixing unpleasantly with the clinical sterility of the room. "It's starting to burn," Elijah whispered. Nurse Ruiz's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I know, sweetheart. We're going slow. I need to loosen it gently so we don't pull the skin." She reached for another cloth. Every movement was steady, purposeful, but her eyes betrayed her. They were angry. Outside the office door, Logan Bennett paced back and forth like a sentry. He had refused to go back to class. A few students from the art room had followed him, forming a quiet circle near the entrance to the nurse's wing. They weren't chatting. They weren't laughing. They were texting, sharing photos, making sure the videos that had captured the moment were saved in multiple phones and drives. Inside the room, Ms. Tate stood awkwardly near the wall. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed her skirt again and again. Her mouth opened once, as if to say something, but then closed again. She had repeated the same line twice already. It was just a mistake, a simple mix-up with the bottles. But no one believed her. Not anymore. Emmy, who had followed Elijah to the nurse's office, sat across the room with her arms crossed. "The craft glue comes in plastic," she said again, her voice louder this time. "With the orange caps." That bottle was silver. It was locked in the cabinet. Nurse Ruiz paused in her work. She turned her eyes on Mrs. Tate. "Superglue can cause chemical burns," she said firmly. "This isn't a mix-up. This is serious." The room went still. Just then, the door opened. Everyone expected to see the principal. But it was Mr. Gregory Hale, the science teacher. His usually cheerful expression had vanished. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Elijah, then the bottle on the counter, then Ms. Tate. He didn't speak right away. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said, "The principal is in a district meeting. I've already texted him. Urgent." He stepped further into the room and stood next to Nurse Ruiz. No one asked him to. He just stayed. 5 more minutes passed. More students gathered in the hallway. The air felt heavy, like the whole building was holding its breath. Then the footsteps came. Fast, measured, familiar. The crowd outside parted. Principal Henry Callahan stepped into the room. He filled the doorway in his navy suit, his presence so commanding that even Ms. Tate took a step back. His eyes swept the room. His gaze landed on the bottle of superglue. Then on Ms. Tate, then on his son. For a brief second, his face changed. Pain, anger. Something raw flashed in his expression. But just as quickly, he composed himself. "Elijah," he said gently, stepping toward the chair. "Are you all right?" Elijah nodded, but barely. Principal Callahan turned to Nurse Ruiz. "Please continue helping my son." Then he turned to Mr. Hale. "Gregory, would you please call the district office? We're going to need a substitute teacher immediately." He faced Mrs. Tate. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Miss Tate, please report to my office." Now. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but thought better of it. She left the room in silence. For the next 20 minutes, everything moved quickly. Nurse Ruiz continued documenting the injuries. Photos were taken. Witness statements were gathered. Mr. Hale spoke quietly to several students, encouraging them to write down what they saw. Even the school secretary came by, holding a folder of notes she had collected over the last few weeks, small complaints from students, overheard comments, inconsistencies in grades. The pieces were coming together. And this time, no one was looking away. That evening, while the sun dipped low over the parking lot, Principal Callahan sat in his office reviewing statements. The photos, the timeline, and the videos. He watched one in silence. It was grainy and shaky, but clear. The bottle. The pour. The stunned faces. The students rising. He didn't cry, but his hand tightened slightly as the video ended. He had told himself that keeping his connection to Elijah private would give his son a fair chance. But now he saw what had happened in that quiet space between what's fair and what's hidden. Now the silence had broken, and the sound of truth was getting louder. The door to the nurse's office closed with a soft click. Outside, the hallway buzzed with muffled voices, the shuffling of feet, the anxious energy of a school that knew something big had happened, but wasn't sure what came next. Inside the room, it was still. Principal Henry Callahan stood near the counter, a folder clutched tightly in his hand. The suit jacket he had carefully pressed that morning now sat slightly askew, as if the day had knocked him off balance. He looked at his son. Elijah sat quietly, an ice pack held gently against his scalp. His hair, usually neat and perfectly twisted, was now matted in sections. His eyes were steady, not red from crying, but tired. Weary in a way no child should be. Principal Callahan crossed the room and pulled up a chair. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice lower than usual, he said, "I'm so sorry, son." Elijah looked up slowly. "It's okay, Dad." But it wasn't. They both knew it. Henry rested a hand lightly on Elijah's shoulder. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad." Elijah didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I didn't want to make things complicated." The weight of that sentence settled between them. Henry leaned back. His face was composed, but the pain in his eyes betrayed him. "You shouldn't have to carry that," he said. "Not here, not in this school." A knock at the door broke the moment. Mr. Gregory Hale stepped in, holding a stack of handwritten statements from students. "They're coming in by the minute," he said. Some students from her other classes wrote things too. "It's a lot." Henry took the papers silently. He flipped through them, one by one. I saw her ignore him, even when his hand was up for 5 minutes straight. She erased one of his correct answers and marked it wrong. She only ever used that tone with Elijah. And on and on. Each page felt heavier than the last. Henry looked up at Mr. Hale. "How long has this been happening?" Gregory exhaled slowly. "Longer than we thought. Honestly, I should have said something sooner. I noticed things. Heard things. I tried to keep an eye on her, but—" He trailed off, ashamed. Henry nodded. "You're not the only one." From the hallway, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Dr. Evelyn Granger, the district superintendent, entered, her face stern and purposeful. "I came as soon as I saw the message," she said, glancing toward Elijah. "Is he all right?" Henry stood, placing himself between them instinctively. "He's shaken, but he's strong." Dr. Granger turned to Mr. Hale. "Gather any documentation you have. I need to see the footage, the statements, and any past complaints. Everything." Then she looked at Henry. "We're holding a formal inquiry tomorrow, but this—" She gestured toward Elijah, the glue-stained towel on the counter, the stillness of the room. "This is more than policy now." Henry nodded. "I know." "And she doesn't know he's your son?" "She does now," he said. "The moment I walked in," Dr. Granger's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll handle this carefully." But decisively. She stepped out, her heels clicking like a metronome against the linoleum. Henry sat back down beside Elijah. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then Elijah said, "She looked at me like I was never good enough, like I didn't belong." Henry's jaw tightened. "But you do," he said firmly. "You belong everywhere in this school, in every room, at every table." Elijah nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. "I tried to keep my head down," he added. "You always said to be respectful, to work hard. I thought that would be enough." Henry swallowed hard. "It should have been." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, face in his hands. "I built this school to be better than that. I pushed for equity programs. Staff training, all of it." Elijah studied his father for a moment. "You tried," he said. Then, a little softer, "Now you know." Henry looked up. "Yes," he said. "Now I know." He stood. "I can't go back and fix the weeks you spent sitting in that classroom, wondering if you were crazy or invisible. But I promise you," he continued, his voice firm now, "this will not be brushed aside, not as a principal, and not as your father." Elijah nodded, his grip tightening slightly around the ice pack. From the hallway came the sounds of more footsteps, parents arriving, concerned staff, murmurs growing louder. The storm was outside the door now, but inside the nurse's office, a new calm had settled. One not born of silence, but of understanding, father and son. Principal and student, both determined that this would never happen again. 1 week after the incident in room 203, the school board hearing room was packed tighter than it had ever been. Parents filled every seat. Teachers lined the walls. Some students sat quietly in the back rows, their phones tucked away, but their eyes alert. Community leaders stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching. The large windows let in the late morning sun, casting long beams across a room that felt more like a courtroom than a school building. At the front, behind a long wooden table, sat the school board members, men and women in suits, with solemn expressions. Their folders were thick. Their silence was heavy, and sitting just a few feet from them, flanked by her attorney, was Mrs. Margaret Tate. Her once composed presence had faded. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't made eye contact with anyone since she walked in. On the opposite side of the room, Principal Henry Callahan sat beside his wife. Between them was Elijah. He wore a soft grey cap, covering the spots where patches of hair had been cut to remove the hardened glue. His posture was straight. His eyes didn't waver. He didn't come to hide, he came to be seen. Dr. Evelyn Granger, the superintendent, stood at the podium. "What happened at Springfield Middle School," she began, her voice clear, "was not an isolated accident." She clicked a remote, and the projector screen behind her came to life. Images appeared. The bottle of superglue, a still from the phone video, a list of past complaints dating back 5 years. The room shifted. Some gasped softly, others leaned forward, mouths tight. "Over the years," Dr. Granger continued, "we received multiple reports of unexplained grading patterns, differential treatment of students, and comments that walked the line of professionalism." She turned toward Ms. Tate. "But it wasn't until now, when a student's body was harmed and the truth was documented from multiple angles, that these concerns could no longer be ignored." Ms. Tate's attorney leaned in, whispering quickly. She shook her head and stood. "I didn't know he was the principal's son," she said, as if that were her defense. A murmur spread across the room. One board member raised his hand. "Would that have made a difference, Ms. Tate?" She froze. "Would you have treated him better if you had known he was someone important?" No answer. Just silence. The board continued. They read statements submitted by students. From Elijah's classmates, from students in other years, from teachers who had quietly kept notes but never felt they had enough proof to speak. I saw her erase Elijah's answers and write in new ones. She rolled her eyes whenever he spoke. She made comments about his hair during break room conversations. And one, written in a looping, careful hand. We all saw it, but we didn't know how to stop it. Then Mr. Gregory Hale was called to the front. He stepped up calmly, paper in hand. "As a fellow teacher," he began, "I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up sooner. I noticed the tone. The comments. I thought maybe I was reading into it. I convinced myself that she'd been teaching for years and maybe just had a strict style." He paused. But watching that video and seeing Elijah's face in the nurse's office, his voice caught for a moment. That's not just bias. That's harm. The next person to speak was Nurse Lena Ruiz. She recounted the moment Elijah walked into her office, glue drying across his scalp. Her voice was measured, but firm. "I've treated playground injuries. Sprained wrists, even broken noses from gym class, but I've never treated something so deliberate. So specific." She lifted her chin slightly. "And I knew the moment I looked at that bottle that it wasn't an accident." Outside, reporters waited. Inside, the room had grown quiet with reflection. Then Dr. Granger asked Elijah if he wished to speak. He nodded, stood slowly, walked to the front of the room, removed his cap. "I used to think that if I just worked hard, stayed polite, followed all the rules, I'd be treated the same." His voice was soft, but I was wrong. He paused. "She saw me every day, and every day she made me feel smaller, like nothing I did was enough." He looked up at the board members, and for a while, I believed her. A beat, But then my classmates saw it too. And they didn't stay quiet. And because they spoke up, I remembered something my grandmother told me. He smiled faintly. She said, "No one gets to shrink your light unless you hand them the switch." The room was still. Even Ms. Tate bowed her head. The board deliberated in private for nearly an hour. When they returned, their decision was swift. Mrs. Tate's teaching license would be revoked. An immediate review of all discrimination complaints across the district would begin. All staff would be required to attend mandatory anti-bias training. And Springfield Middle School would become the pilot site for a district-wide student equity council. Principal Callahan stood once more. "This isn't just about one teacher," he said. "It's about the systems that let this happen, and our commitment to making sure it never happens again." Elijah didn't smile as they walked out of the hearing room, but his steps were steady, and his head was high. The silence that had once surrounded him was gone. In its place stood something far louder. Truth. And finally, people were listening. It had been 3 weeks since the hearing. 3 weeks since Springfield Middle School had been on the front page of the local paper. 3 weeks since a classroom incident became the spark for change. But this change wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with banners or loudspeakers. It arrived quietly, in small acts, measured steps, and conversations that never used to happen. The hallways looked the same. Same lockers, same tiled floors. But there was something different in the way students looked at each other now. Like they were seeing more than faces, like they were finally paying attention. Elijah Carter walked those hallways every morning, his grey cap replaced by a confident step and freshly styled twists, carefully restored by his grandmother and a local natural hair specialist who had volunteered her time after hearing his story. He no longer kept his head down, and people noticed, not because he asked them to, but because the truth had changed him and changed the school around him. One Friday afternoon, Principal Henry Callahan stood at the front of the library, speaking to a group of visiting educators. They had come from other schools, other districts, asking how Springfield had responded so quickly. How had a single incident transformed into a district-wide reform movement? He didn't give them a manual. He gave them a mirror. "We listened," he said simply, "to our students, to our staff, to the silence between the complaints." He talked about the new anonymous reporting system now available to every student and teacher. He described the weekly teacher training sessions, led not just by outside consultants, but by community members and parents. He showed them the schedule for classroom audits, the updated grading policies, and the new equity team made up of teachers, students, and administrative staff. But what impressed them most was what they saw in the students. In room 203, the classroom where it all began, the door stayed closed for several days after Ms. Tate's removal. When it reopened, the walls had been freshly painted. The posters were new. And a new teacher, Mrs. Kim, welcomed students with warmth and a gentle authority that immediately softened the space. The air didn't feel tight anymore. Students raised their hands without fear of being ignored, and when Elijah walked in, Mrs. Kim greeted him like every other student. With dignity, with care, with a smile that reached her eyes. Across the hall, Mr. Hale's science classroom had become more than a place to learn about circuits and chemical reactions. It had become a place where students felt safe to ask deeper questions. One afternoon, a student raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't anyone say anything sooner?" There was a pause. Then Mr. Hale answered honestly, "Because we thought being silent was being neutral. But silence can protect the wrong people." He looked at Elijah. "And you reminded us of that." The biggest change, though, wasn't inside the classrooms. It was in the student lounge, where the newly formed Student Equity Council met every Thursday after school. Elijah didn't start the council, but he was invited to help lead it. He didn't hesitate. At the first meeting, he stood before a small group of students, some he knew, many he didn't. And he said, "I don't want to be the face of what happened. I want to be part of what happens next." The room went still, then heads nodded, and the real work began. They organized listening sessions, invited other students to write about their experiences, worked with the principal's office to suggest changes to school events, materials, and even cafeteria offerings. Each week, the group grew. Each week, more students found their voices. Elijah sat beside Logan at those meetings, watching as students who had once stayed silent now leaned in, raised hands, challenged old thinking. It wasn't perfect. Some students still rolled their eyes. Some parents still sent in emails. But the difference now? People were responding. People were listening. One afternoon, after the final bell, Elijah returned to room 203. The room was empty. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long lines across the desks. He walked slowly to the seat he had sat in during those first few weeks. It looked the same. But it felt different. He sat down, opened his notebook, and began writing. Not for a grade. Not for anyone else, just for himself. After a few minutes, Mrs. Kim entered quietly. "I figured I'd find you here," she said. He smiled. "I guess it still feels like a part of me is in this room." She nodded. "A part of a lot of people." She placed a folder on his desk. "These are the applications for the mentorship program." Elijah's eyes widened. "There are this many already?" 32. And counting. He opened the folder. Inside were letters from younger students, requesting to be mentored by members of the Equity Council. Some wanted help with schoolwork. Others just wanted someone to talk to. Elijah looked up. Mrs. Kim was already walking to the door. "You've started something important," she said. "Don't stop now." He sat in silence for a moment after she left, listening to the soft hum of the vents, the sound of a school still breathing, still learning. He stood, gathered the folder, and walked out of room 203. This time, not as a student who had suffered in silence, but as someone who had helped turn a moment of harm into a movement of healing. By early spring, Springfield Middle School had become something no one expected. Not a scandal, not a cautionary tale. A model. What had started as a quiet act of harm, one teacher, one student, had become the reason other schools began to ask, "What are we missing?" It wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about what happened after the cameras were gone. Elijah Carter felt it most clearly one Saturday morning, standing in front of a gymnasium full of 4th and 5th graders at the nearby elementary school. He had been invited to speak just 5 minutes. Nothing scripted. No microphone, just a young boy with a story that had grown too big to keep inside. The students sat on the floor, crisscross applesauce, wide-eyed and wiggling. Some whispered. A few teachers stood at the back, watching closely. Elijah took a breath. Then he spoke. "When I first came to my new school," he said, "I didn't tell anyone who my dad was. I just wanted to be another kid." I thought if I was respectful, quiet, and tried hard, that would be enough. He paused. But it wasn't. I was treated differently. And for a long time, I stayed quiet. A few kids frowned, trying to understand. Then something happened, Elijah continued, something that made it impossible to stay quiet. And when I spoke up, I wasn't alone anymore. People listened. He smiled gently. And now, my school is different. And maybe yours can be too. The teachers clapped first, then the kids followed, some too young to grasp it all. But not too young to feel that something important had just been said. That same week, the district office hosted its first student-led change panel, a pilot initiative inspired directly by the events at Springfield. Elijah sat alongside Logan Bennett and two other students from the Equity Council. The room was filled with principals, assistant superintendents, and school board members from across the region. Each student took turns sharing what change looked like, not from spreadsheets or policies, but from the inside. Elijah talked about the anonymous reporting system. Logan shared how their hallway artwork had evolved to reflect the diversity of the student body. Another student spoke about how lunchroom seating had quietly shifted, how more kids felt free to sit where they wanted without being judged. But when one board member asked, "How do you measure impact?" Elijah answered with something no one forgot. "You can't always measure what's changed by looking at test scores," he said, "but you can tell when a kid walks through the hallway and feels like they belong." That sentence ended up printed on the district website. It was written in bold, just under the title, "Why Inclusion Isn't Optional." By April, 3 more schools had requested visits from Springfield's Student Equity Council. They didn't come with scripts. They came with stories. And stories, it turned out, were more powerful than memos. At one school, Elijah met a boy named Darren who reminded him of himself. Quiet. Smart. Hair neatly braided. After the panel, Darren waited until the crowd thinned before approaching him. "My teacher always says I talk too soft," Darren said, "even when I'm just trying to explain." Elijah nodded slowly. "I used to think I needed to be louder to be heard," he said. "But it's not about volume. It's about being willing to speak when it matters." He looked Darren in the eye. "And you just did." Darren smiled. At home, Elijah's parents watched it all unfold with quiet pride. They didn't post videos online. They didn't tell reporters what to say. They packed his lunch. They drove him to weekend meetings. And sometimes, late at night, they sat with him at the kitchen table when the weight of it all felt too big. Because change, even good change, takes energy, and even the strongest voice needs rest. One afternoon, Principal Callahan received a message from a district in another state. A principal there had read about Springfield's reforms. "We've had our own, Elijah," the message said. "Only we didn't know it until it was too late. Thank you for leading by example." Callahan printed the message and placed it in a file marked, "Beyond Us." In art class, Elijah stood with Mrs. Kim, helping hang a new mural. It had been painted over several weekends by students from every grade. No faces were painted the same. No voices were depicted at the same volume. And yet, they stood together, hands outstretched, smiling. Whole. When the final piece was hung, Elijah stepped back. "I like it," he said. Mrs. Kim looked at the wall, then at him. "You helped build this," she said. He thought for a second. "No, he said quietly. We all did. By May, Springfield Middle School wasn't being called the school where the glue thing happened. It was being called the place where students changed a system. And Elijah. He was no longer just the boy who once sat in room 203. He was the reason schools across the state had started asking their students not what they learned, but how they felt. He was the proof that one voice, when lifted with courage, could echo far beyond the walls of a classroom. And he was just getting started. 6 months had passed. The classroom where it all began had been transformed. Room 203 was still filled with desks and whiteboards, still echoed with the soft hum of the overhead lights and the scratch of pencils on paper. But the energy was different now. Not lighter, more aware. Posters on the walls no longer just showed bright phrases like "try your best" or "be kind." Now there were photos of student projects, a wall of anonymous affirmations, and a poster that read, "We don't whisper about fairness. We speak it." Elijah Carter had not become a celebrity. He hadn't started a non-profit. He didn't lead chants or take interviews. But when he walked through the front doors of Springfield Middle each morning, students noticed. Not because he was the kid from the glue thing, but because he kept showing up with purpose. He still helped younger students with math during lunch. Still sat in the back of meetings, listening before speaking. Still wrote in his notebook every afternoon before going home. Only now, other kids wrote too. They wrote about what made them feel seen. They wrote when they felt ignored. They wrote stories like Elijah had, quietly, honestly, and they knew someone would read them. One evening, the school hosted a community event called Voices That Changed Us. Parents, students, teachers, and community members packed the auditorium. Elijah sat backstage, holding a folded piece of paper. He didn't like microphones. He didn't like big speeches, but he'd been asked to say something, not to close a chapter, but to mark a beginning. He stepped onto the stage. The lights were warm. The crowd, still. He didn't unfold the paper. He just looked out at the faces. Some familiar, some curious, some tired from fighting their own quiet battles. And he began. I used to think courage looked like yelling, like fighting. He glanced down. But I learned that sometimes courage is waking up, putting on your shoes and walking back into the room that hurt you so you can help change it. A pause. I'm not here because I wanted to be strong. I'm here because I had to be. He looked at the front row, at his parents, at Logan, at Mr. Hale, Nurse Ruiz, and Mrs. Kim. And because I wasn't alone. The applause that followed wasn't loud at first. But it grew, not because it was expected, but because it was real. Later that night, Elijah sat on the front steps of the school with his dad. They watched the last few families leave under the soft glow of the parking lot lights. You know, Principal Callahan said, when I took this job, I wanted to be the kind of leader who made a difference. Elijah smiled slightly. You did. His dad chuckled. Not the way I planned. No, Elijah agreed. Better. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elijah asked, Do you think it'll last, the changes? His father looked out over the empty campus. That depends. On what? On whether we keep listening? And keep telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Elijah nodded slowly. A breeze moved across the lot. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closed and laughter echoed faintly. I'm tired, Elijah said. I know, his father replied. But I'm proud. I know that too. They stood. Tomorrow would be another day. The students would return. The classrooms would fill again. New stories would begin. And room 203, it would still be there. But now, it carried more than just lessons and worksheets. It carried memory. And from that memory came purpose. Because when one voice dares to speak, others learn to listen. And when enough of us listen, things change. Sometimes, the deepest lessons don't come from textbooks or lectures. They come from quiet moments, from injustice we didn't want to see, and from the strength of a child who refused to stay silent. Elijah Carter's story reminds us that real change often begins not with grand speeches, but with a quiet voice that chooses to speak up when it's hardest. In a world that still struggles with fairness and bias, this story asks, what happens when we stop looking away? What shifts when a community listens not just to the loudest voice, but to the one that's been ignored the longest? For many older Americans who've lived through times of social change, this story echoes a familiar truth. We all have a role to play, whether as parents, educators, neighbors, or simply human beings. We must remain willing to see what's wrong, name it out loud, and help make it right. Because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins in classrooms, and sometimes it starts with one child who decides enough is enough.